Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Ethan Connors always knew being a commercial pilot meant sacrifices. At 42, he carried the responsibility of flying hundreds of passengers across oceans and continents, staying completely calm even when turbulence shook the plane. 15 years earlier, when he met Rebecca at a bar near the University of Washington campus, he believed he'd found someone who truly understood this life split between sky and earth. Rebecca was smart and driven, studying business administration, talking about her career with the same spark in her eyes that Ethan had when describing the feeling of taking off at dawn. They got married in a simple but emotional ceremony in a garden in Bellevue, Washington. The years that followed brought 3 children: Jake, 13, obsessed with basketball; Mia, 10, passionate about drawing; and Sophie, 7, the energetic youngest who loved dancing around the house. Ethan spent about 15 days a month flying international routes, crossing time zones, sleeping in impersonal hotels in London, Tokyo, Sydney. Rebecca built a solid career as a human resources manager at a tech company in Seattle, running the household and keeping everything together while Ethan was 40,000 feet in the air. Their communication was constant but shallow: quick messages about daily logistics, hurried video calls where Ethan saw his kids' faces on his phone screen and felt a pang of guilt for being so far away. Rebecca always seemed tired in those calls, but he blamed it on work stress. He never imagined there was another reason for that distant look. The Tuesday that changed everything started unexpectedly. Ethan was mid-flight to Tokyo when the aircraft's monitoring system detected a secondary hydraulic failure. Not catastrophic, but serious enough to return to Seattle. The landing went smoothly, but repairs would take time. The airline offered him an unexpected 48-hour layover. It was 2 p.m. on a sunny Tuesday. The kids would be in school until 3:30, and Rebecca should still be at the office until 6. Ethan decided to surprise the family. He took an Uber straight from the airport to their home in Bellevue, a 2-story colonial-style house. During the 30-minute ride, Ethan texted Rebecca asking how her day was going, but didn't mention he was back. She replied with a tired face emoji and the words, "Long day, can't wait to get home." The Uber pulled up in front of the house at 2:15 p.m. Ethan grabbed his small suitcase and walked toward the door. That's when he noticed something strange. Rebecca's car, a silver Honda CR-V, was parked in the garage. Ethan frowned. Rebecca always drove into downtown Seattle for work. Why was she home on a Tuesday afternoon? Maybe she was working remotely, he thought. He unlocked the front door with his key and stepped inside quietly. The house was silent, but it was a heavy silence, different from usual. He set his suitcase down in the entryway and headed toward the living room. Then he saw it, a man's leather jacket hanging carelessly over the couch. It wasn't his. He recognized the brand, a pricey, biker-style jacket. His heart started pounding faster. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight. At the top of the hallway, he heard voices coming from the master bedroom: Rebecca's voice, low and intimate, and a man's laugh. Ethan felt his blood turn cold. He moved toward the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he saw 2 bodies tangled together in bed. Ethan shoved the door open. Rebecca and the man jerked apart instantly, their faces frozen in shock. Ethan recognized the man immediately: Kevin Strauss, Rebecca's operations manager at her company, a dark-haired guy with always neatly combed back hair, who wore expensive shirts and talked too loudly at corporate parties. Ethan had spoken to him a few times at company events, always thinking Kevin was arrogant. And now this man was in his bed, with his wife, in the house Ethan paid for. Rebecca screamed his name, trying to pull the sheet over herself, eyes wide with panic. Kevin jumped up, tripping over his own pants. There was a moment of chaos, Rebecca stammering, Kevin mumbling incoherent apologies. But Ethan didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just looked at them both with pure contempt and icy calm, and said in a low, cutting voice, get out of my house. Now. Kevin dressed in record time, grabbed the jacket, and practically ran down the stairs. The front door slammed shut. Rebecca tried to approach Ethan, reaching out her hand, eyes filled with tears, saying they could talk, that she could explain. But Ethan was already out of the room. He went downstairs, picked up his suitcase, and walked out the door without saying a word. Rebecca ran after him, begging on the doorstep, but Ethan was already halfway down the street, calling another Uber. He went straight to a hotel near the airport, checked into a sterile room, and sat on the edge of the bed for hours, staring at his phone, which kept ringing with desperate calls from Rebecca. He didn't answer any. Instead, he Googled "divorce lawyer Seattle." He found a well-reviewed firm and left a message requesting an urgent consultation. Then he did something some might see as hasty, but for him was necessary. He called Rebecca's human resources department. The next morning, Ethan sat in the office of Amanda Chu, a divorce attorney with 20 years of experience. Amanda listened carefully, taking notes, asking direct questions about timelines, finances, and the kids' routines. She was clear: under Washington state law, which follows equitable distribution and doesn't require proof of fault for divorce, adultery itself wouldn't drastically affect property division, but it could significantly influence custody decisions, especially if it showed Rebecca's behavior negatively impacted the children's well-being. Amanda asked if Ethan had documented proof. Ethan explained he'd seen everything with his own eyes and could provide exact dates and times. Amanda suggested requesting, during legal discovery, all of Rebecca's messages and emails, especially those sent through company accounts. Ethan agreed, signing the initial paperwork to start the process. Meanwhile, the call Ethan had made to HR began to take effect. He'd been careful in how he reported the situation, keeping a professional tone. He explained that he discovered a personal relationship between Rebecca Connors, the HR manager, and Kevin Strauss, the operations manager, and believed it violated the company's conflict of interest policies. He didn't go into graphic details, just presented the facts. The company had extremely strict rules about relationships between managerial employees, precisely because they'd faced workplace lawsuits in the past. Their policy required any personal relationship to be officially reported to HR so preventive measures could be taken. Rebecca and Kevin had never reported their relationship. Worse, during the internal investigation opened after Ethan's report, the compliance team discovered Rebecca and Kevin had exchanged hundreds of personal, intimate emails using company accounts, violating the acceptable use policy. Some messages were explicit, discussing meetings during work hours, mentioning the use of empty conference rooms for private moments, planning personal weekend trips disguised as work travel. The company had no choice. Kevin Strauss was fired immediately, his termination processed in less than a week. Rebecca, who had 15 years with the company, received slightly different treatment, but no less severe. She was suspended without pay for 30 days, and when she returned, she was formally demoted from manager to senior analyst, with a salary reduction of about 40%. The news spread quickly through the office. Her professional reputation was destroyed. The divorce proceedings moved efficiently. Amanda Chu and her team worked fast, gathering the couple's financial records, requesting phone logs, and, through a court order, gaining access to Rebecca's corporate emails. The evidence was overwhelming. The emails between Rebecca and Kevin confirmed the affair and revealed it had been going on for at least 8 months, starting after a conference in San Francisco. There were messages where Rebecca admitted feeling neglected by Ethan because of his travel, where Kevin praised her and made her feel desired. There were even plans for a weekend getaway to Vancouver that never happened because Ethan returned from a trip earlier than expected. During custody negotiations, Rebecca argued Ethan was too absent because of his pilot career and that she should have primary custody of the children. But Amanda dismantled that argument, presenting emails where Rebecca confessed to Kevin that she was happy when Ethan traveled because it gave her more time to be with him, showing she'd used his trips to facilitate the affair. Plus, Ethan had an impeccable record of emotional involvement with his kids. He never missed birthdays, always called the children before bed when overseas, helped with homework through video calls, and prioritized every free moment. The judge overseeing the case reviewed all the evidence and heard testimony. Ethan brought in parents of the kids' friends who confirmed he was extremely present and devoted. Rebecca couldn't offer any solid counterarguments. The ruling was clear: Ethan would have primary custody of all 3 children, with Rebecca entitled to alternating weekend visits and some weeks during school breaks. The Bellevue house was put up for sale. The proceeds would be split equally, but Ethan would use his share to buy a smaller home in a nearby neighborhood, ensuring the kids wouldn't have to change schools. Rebecca, with her drastically reduced salary and mounting legal expenses, had to move into a 2-bedroom apartment in a less affluent part of Seattle. Kevin Strauss, fired and with his reputation ruined, left Seattle entirely and moved to Portland, where he got a job at a smaller startup with lower pay. He blocked Rebecca on every social platform and never responded to her attempts to reach out. For Kevin, the affair had been a convenient fling, and now that it had cost him his job, he wanted nothing more to do with her. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Ethan's life had found a new rhythm. He'd adjusted his flight schedule to domestic routes, accepting a pay cut in exchange for more time at home. Jake, Mia, and Sophie were adjusting to the new reality, attending family therapy. They spent alternating weekends with Rebecca, but always returned to Ethan's house with a palpable sense of relief. Rebecca tried to be a good mother during her visits, but the kids, especially Jake, old enough to understand what had happened, kept an emotional distance. It was in this context that Ethan made a decision many might consider controversial, but for him was necessary. He organized a family meeting. It wasn't something common in the Connors family. Family meetings were usually reserved for happy announcements. But Ethan felt he had to do this. Since the divorce, Rebecca had told her own version of events to her family, especially her parents, portraying Ethan as an absent, emotionally distant husband who never valued her, suggesting the divorce resulted from years of emotional neglect. Some family members had started questioning Ethan, wondering if he could have been more present, if his travel hadn't contributed to the marriage's end. Ethan invited everyone: his parents, Robert and Linda Connors, retired and living in Spokane; Rebecca's parents, Daniel and Patricia Holloway, still living in Seattle; Ethan's younger brother Marcus, a software engineer in San Francisco; and Rebecca's sister Emily, a teacher in Tacoma who'd always had a close relationship with Ethan. A few close aunts and cousins were also invited. Ethan invited Rebecca too, sending a formal email explaining the meeting would be an opportunity to clear up misunderstandings and ensure everyone had a clear understanding of the events that led to the divorce. Rebecca, hopeful that maybe Ethan was trying to rebuild a bridge, accepted the invitation. The meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon in the house Ethan had bought. The kids were temporarily staying at a neighbor's house. The living room was set up with extra chairs, coffee, and cookies on the table, an atmosphere trying to be welcoming but thick with tension. Everyone arrived on time. Rebecca was the last to enter, wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her eyes revealing sleepless nights. She greeted the family with timid nods and sat apart from the main circle, next to her sister Emily. Ethan began speaking. His voice was calm but firm, the same tone he used during turbulence announcements, conveying authority and control. He thanked everyone for coming and explained he'd organized this meeting because he felt there was too much misinformation circulating about the divorce, and as a father of 3 children who would eventually ask questions, he wanted to make sure the truth was documented and clear for everyone involved. Rebecca went pale. She realized, in that moment, this wasn't an attempt at reconciliation. Ethan opened a leather folder on the coffee table. Inside were carefully organized documents, copies of emails, message logs, HR reports, legal filings from the divorce. He started with the timeline. He explained that 6 months ago, he'd unexpectedly returned home due to a technical issue with the aircraft. He described, with unsettling calm, what he'd found when he walked in: another man's jacket on the couch, voices coming from the bedroom, the scene he'd seen when he opened the door. He mentioned Kevin Strauss by full name, identifying him as Rebecca's co-worker. Rebecca's parents, Daniel and Patricia, visibly crumbled. Patricia covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. Daniel clenched his fists, his face red with shame and rage. Ethan continued. He explained that after the discovery, he'd immediately sought legal counsel and also reported the inappropriate relationship to the company's HR department, not out of revenge, but because he believed the company had the right to know its policies were being violated. He then presented copies of the emails exchanged between Rebecca and Kevin, not all of them, but a carefully selected set demonstrating the extent and duration of the affair. Messages where Rebecca confessed feeling alive again when she was with Kevin. Messages where they planned meetings during work hours, using company conference rooms. Messages where Rebecca admitted she was happy when Ethan traveled because it gave her more freedom. The room was utterly silent. Linda Connors, Ethan's mother, looked at Rebecca with deep disappointment. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. Emily let go of her sister's hand and pulled back slightly. Ethan went on, explaining the professional consequences, Kevin's termination, Rebecca's demotion and suspension, the loss of reputation for both. He explained he hadn't actively sought these outcomes, they were the natural result of the choices Rebecca and Kevin had made. He then addressed custody. He read excerpts from the court rulings, highlighting that the judge had prioritized the children's well-being and determined Ethan provided the most stable environment, despite his demanding career. He mentioned that Rebecca had tried to argue he was too absent, but the evidence itself, the emails where she celebrated his trips, had completely disproven that claim. Rebecca tried to speak, tried to interrupt, but her voice came out weak and trembling. She mumbled something about a terrible mistake and being so sorry, but Ethan raised his hand, asking for silence. He wasn't finished. Ethan explained why he was doing this. He looked directly at Rebecca's parents and said, "Daniel, Patricia, I know Rebecca told you our marriage ended because I was absent, because my travel created an emotional distance she couldn't bear. But the truth is, she made a conscious choice to betray the trust we built over 15 years, to put her personal desires above the well-being of our 3 children, to lie repeatedly, not just to me, but to the whole family. And I can't allow this distorted version of the facts to be the only one circulating, especially because Jake, Mia, and Sophie will one day grow up and ask questions. And when they do, I want everyone in this room to know exactly what happened." He then showed the last pages of the folder, photos he'd taken of the leather jacket on the couch that day, records of dates and times, even a letter Kevin Strauss had been forced to sign during his termination, acknowledging the inappropriate relationship and admitting he'd violated company policy. It was meticulous, irrefutable documentation. Daniel Holloway stood up abruptly and walked out of the room without a word, unable to face his daughter. Patricia wept silently, looking at Rebecca with a mix of maternal love and profound disappointment. Emily hugged her knees, clearly uncomfortable but unable to deny the truth presented. Ethan's parents, Robert and Linda, stayed silent, but their looks toward their son were filled with deep pride. Marcus placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder in solidarity. Ethan closed the folder and said, "I didn't do this to humiliate anyone. I did it because the truth matters. Because Jake, Mia, and Sophie deserve to grow up knowing their father fought for them, that their father wasn't the villain in this story. And because all of you deserve to know what really happened, not the edited version that's been circulating." Rebecca stood up, tears streaming down her face. She tried to say something, opened her mouth several times, but no words came. Finally, she grabbed her purse and quickly left the house, slamming the door behind her. Emily followed a few minutes later, clearly torn between loyalty to her sister and the shock of what she'd heard. The meeting continued for a few more minutes in heavy silence. Patricia Holloway, still crying, approached Ethan and apologized on her daughter's behalf, saying she had no idea the situation was this severe. Ethan accepted the apology with a nod, explaining he held no one accountable except Rebecca and Kevin. Daniel Holloway returned to the room a few minutes later, eyes red, and extended his hand to Ethan, gripping it tightly without saying a word, but the gesture said everything. The meeting ended shortly after. People left slowly, still processing everything. Some hugged Ethan, others simply nodded, clearly shaken. When everyone was gone, Ethan sat alone in the living room, looking out the window as the sun began to set over Seattle. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel joy. Only a deep, weary relief. He'd done what needed to be done. He'd protected his reputation. He'd ensured the truth was known. He'd created a documented record that, when his children grew up and inevitably asked questions, could be consulted. That night, when Jake, Mia, and Sophie came home, Ethan made their favorite dinner, spaghetti with meatballs. The kids were excited, telling stories about the games they'd played, unaware of the meeting. Ethan watched his 3 children laughing around the table and felt a peace he hadn't felt in months. He'd lost a marriage. He'd been betrayed in the worst possible way. But he'd kept his dignity. And, more importantly, he'd kept his children. In the weeks that followed, Ethan learned Rebecca had tried calling several family members, trying to explain herself, but most didn't answer or kept conversations short and cold. Patricia and Daniel visited Ethan a few times to see their grandchildren, always bringing gifts and offering help. They never mentioned Rebecca during those visits, and Ethan respected that silence. Months later, Ethan learned Kevin Strauss had married a woman he met through an app in Portland, trying to rebuild his life. Rebecca continued working at the same company, but now in a lower position, avoided by colleagues, carrying the weight of the consequences. She saw the kids on alternating weekends, but the relationship was damaged in ways that would take years to repair. Ethan found a routine that worked. He kept flying, but now on predictable routes. He attended every one of Jake's basketball games, every one of Mia's art shows, every one of Sophie's dance recitals. He rebuilt his life brick by brick, not with anger or bitterness, but with quiet determination to be the best father he could be. And every night, before bed, he looked at the framed photo on his nightstand, a recent picture of the 3 kids laughing in the park, and knew he'd made the right choices. Truth came at a price, but it was worth it. And the silence that had filled that family meeting wasn't a silence of defeat, it was the silence of truth finally revealed, of dignity restored, of a man who'd faced the most painful betrayal and emerged not as a victim, but as a survivor. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.